Right. Aloha, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our May Slice of PI-CASC seminar hosted by the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center, or PI-CASC. I'm Brad Romine. I'm the University Consortium Deputy Director for PI-CASC. And for those of you joining us online, or for those of you joining us in person, looks like most of you help yourself to lunch. Please feel free to grab seconds if there's some remaining. Yes, just keeping in theme with our Slice of PI-CASC seminar. We've got some pizza pies here in the room, and Rachel's actually provided another pie for dessert. What kind of pie is it today, Rachel?
Strawberry rhubarb.
Strawberry rhubarb. So stay afterwards for some dessert pie as well. This Slice of PI-CASC seminar series provides a venue for sharing state-of-the-art climate adaptation research and science to management applications in Hawaii, U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands, and beyond. We're recording this presentation. It will be available on the PI-CASC website in a few days, a week or so maybe, under our news and events. So feel free to view it again if you missed something or share it around with friends and colleagues. For those of you joining us online, thank you very much for being here. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. We will leave some time for questions following the presentation. You can feel free to leave questions in the chat along the way, and we'll come to the room for questions at the end as well. So today we are very excited to have Dr. Ashley McGuigan joining us today online to share on her work on how ecological traits predict nutritional traits in complex agroforestry systems. Ashley works to support farmers, ranchers, foresters, and land managers in Hawaii and the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands as they navigate changing environmental conditions. As the Hawaii and U.S. API coordinator for the USDA Southwest Climate Hub and an assistant extension specialist at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, she collaborates with local communities and partners to provide science-based resources and practical strategies that enhance food systems resilience, promote sustainable land management, and strengthen agroforestry efforts. Ashley is based in Hilo. Her work bridges research and application, ensuring that producers have the tools that they need to make informed decisions for long-term productivity. Ashley, if you're ready, go ahead and pull your slides up, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me see here. All right. Does that look great to you all?
Looks good on our end, yeah.
All right, great. Well, thanks again for having me today. As mentioned, my name is Ashley McGuigan, extension specialist in climate, agroforestry, food systems, and NREM at UH Manoa. Also the coordinator for the USDA Climate Hub, the Hawaii USAPI, US-affiliated Pacific Island region within the Southwest Climate Hub. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about how ecological traits predict nutritional traits in complex agroforests in Fiji, or more specifically, how ecological functional diversity predicts nutritional functional diversity. And so with that, before we get going too far, oops, let me see. Yeah, so before we get started, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the people and the place and the ancestors of these places that I'll be talking about. The work that I will be presenting on today took place over a number of years. And so without the generosity and the care and the time and the effort that hundreds of people put into this project, I wouldn't be able to share with you the insights that we've gotten from it today. So I just want to take a moment to recognize all of these people and thank all of these places, 10 different villages across Fiji. I also like to recognize the work that my project built off of. All research has a genealogy, and so I think this is important to recognize. My work builds off of a project that started in 2014 around the links between ecological knowledge, services, and resilience, led by multiple people. But this includes Tamar Tickton, Rachel Dack, Shimona Kwazi, a number of others that you might recognize in this photo. It was a collaboration between the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the University of the South Pacific. I also want to briefly acknowledge our team, and I'll generally be referring to this work in the collective we or our, as without the support and guidance of these folks, none of this work would be possible either. So Mesu Tora, he was involved in a lot of the agroforestry biodiversity surveys and farmer interviews that I'll be talking about. Unavuli assisted in a lot of the nutritional aspects of this work, including recording dietary recall surveys and working with the National Food and Nutrition Center. Rosi Bhaktivasanga, she also contributed heavily to the nutritional aspects of this work and the interviews. And then finally, Vinny Tikonavuli, who helped also in conducting agroforestry biodiversity surveys and informative interviews that helped to contextualize some of this work. So to give a broad overview of this work and what I'll be talking about, two of the largest challenges facing the world, and particularly in the Pacific today, are the loss of biodiversity and an increase in nutrition-related non-communicable diseases, or NCDs, incidence and mortality. These things are inextricably linked through our food systems. And so food systems are these complex social ecological systems that range in scale and involve a number of different socioeconomic, cultural, environmental, and political actors and conditions. On the food production side, a lot of modern agricultural systems globally and in the Pacific have largely become intensified singular crop systems or monocultures that require these really frequent and intense applications of fertilizers and pesticides that have these negative downstream impacts on human and environmental health. At the same time, the food produced loses nutritional value at multiple scales, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but which have contributed to an NCD or a non-communicable disease epidemic in the Pacific. Confounding the issue, these agroecological systems affect and are affected by climate change, which is projected to increase global food demand by anywhere between 30 to 62% by 2050, with, of course, unique implications for Hawaii and the Pacific. And so therefore, the challenge really remains to find ways to provide food not only for a changing Pacific population, but to do so in ways that achieve both human and environmental health goals at the same time. And so on the food production side of the systems equation, locally adapted agroecological systems have provided a diverse and stable source of nutrition for societies in the past, and they have the potential to be restored to fulfill these needs going into the future, as evidenced by some of Natalie Kuroshima's work in Hawaii has shown. And across the world. And although these locally adapted food production system examples are all Pacific examples, these systems include many different practices, such as home gardening in the top right, riparian buffers, forest farming, or sort of agroforestry, which is what I'll talk mostly about today, la'i or wetland kalo farming in Hawaii. And then here's an example of silvopastoral ranching over in Vanuatu. This includes things like rotational fallowing and many more practices. Importantly, these places provide diverse ecological services, including but not limited to things like water regulation, carbon sequestration, providing habitats for endangered species in places where genetic diversity can be maintained through things like hybridization events across with crop wild relatives. And so, as I mentioned, I'll be talking mostly or focusing in on multi-story or multi-purpose agroforestry for the purposes of this talk. And so while agroecosystems vary globally in Fiji and across much of the Pacific, this is the type of multi-purpose agroforestry that is practiced. This is actually an example from Vanuatu, where I've also worked, and I like this image because it kind of shows you the sort of mosaic nature of agroforests across forested, fallow, and planted areas. So in the foreground, you can see a sort of fallowed area. In the midground, you can see the agroforestry type practices, and then the very back, forested areas. And so these are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the Pacific. This biodiversity, of course, includes both native and introduced species and food and non-food species. While they are expected to be the most biodiverse ecosystems, there needs to be more documentation in terms of what all that encompasses. Now, when we think about agroforestry globally, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, defines a forest as an area with 10% or more tree cover. And so using this definition, when applied over all agricultural land globally, it was found that agroforestry is practiced across about 43% of all agricultural land. If you agree with the 10%, that's if you agree with this 10% definition. If you agree with a little bit of a higher tree cover at 20%, this still means that about 24% of all land is under agroforestry, and provides food and livelihood security to anywhere between 25 to 33% of rural populations globally. Another assessment by the United Nations estimates also that the United Nations estimates up to 33% of the world population relies on these systems for their subsistence needs. So it's a really important ecosystem across the board. And so on the nutrition side, as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about this part of the equation. Our food is decreasing in nutritional value due to global change and climate change. A lot of this nutritional diversity is occurring at the individual food group and food system scales. So I'll dive a little bit more into that in the next couple slides. So what do I mean by at the individual level? So take, for example, watermelons. We are now able to produce watermelons and many other crops with greater mass and higher caloric content, right? So these things are just physically getting bigger. We're getting greater yields. Individually, they're increasing in size, but we're not necessarily scaling up the micronutrient content with it. And so we're getting a lot of energy dense foods, but not necessarily the same level of vitamins and minerals that are important for our bodies to function. This is called the dilution effect. It's caused by multiple different factors. Climate or CO2 increase is one of them. And then it's also occurring at the food group scale. So we have a loss of diversity within food groups, right? So depending on the season, for example, we might have had access to, say, 8 different types of fruit to consume throughout the week. And now today, while we might be still able to consume multiple servings of fruit throughout the week, they are generally coming from a relatively smaller range of fruits and consequently a smaller range of micronutrients consumed or homogenization of micronutrients, right, consumed. So where we might have been eating 5 different fruits in a day, now maybe we're only eating 2 different kinds of fruits in a day. We're just eating more of those 2 fruits to get our recommended daily serving. And then finally at the food system scale. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification, of course, but of the multiple ways that this is occurring. But for one example, we can lose a lot of nutritional diversity just through food processing in and of itself, where we take a whole food, say an orange, for example, and we process that into orange juice. In this act, we're removing important nutrition like fiber in this case that helps to slow the digestion of the sugars within that orange juice. Which would help to avoid a blood sugar spike that otherwise can be caused when consuming it only in its juice form. And then, of course, socioeconomics are changing, and these cause dietary shifts or nutrition transition. And so I'll be the first to admit these are both pictures of foods that I've eaten, and so it's a much more complex question beyond knowing just what is healthy or not, right? These dietary shifts are caused by multiple complex changes in socioeconomic conditions, activity levels in our jobs, healthcare and health conditions and access to care, changes in food culture, and an increase in monetary wealth, among other factors. And so all of these are contributing to a non-communicable disease epidemic globally, but also particularly in the Pacific. NCDs are now responsible for about 70% of all mortality worldwide, and the Pacific is among the worst impacted by this. In Hawaii specifically, heart disease is one of the leading causes of death. And then finally, confounding all of these issues, climate is also causing dramatic changes. Particularly relevant in the Pacific are changes to storm frequency and occurrence. So cyclone events in the Pacific have exhibited unprecedented behavior in trajectory, velocity, and geographic occurrence. And this is the context within which this research that I'll be talking about takes place. So in 2016, Fiji experienced the strongest cyclone in recorded history in the South Pacific, Cyclone Winston. It was Category 5, and at the time, meteorological scientists discussed the option or the need for even creating a Category 6, just because of the magnitude of this particular cyclone and ones that had just recently preceded it. And so cyclones of this magnitude are expected to increase in occurrence, causing massive damages to agroforests. And so as you can see here in the bottom right hand of the screen, Mesu is actually standing at the base of where this tree on the left side used to be standing in an agroforest that we were working in. And so given all of these changes globally, and with the acute implications for the Pacific, it becomes extremely important for us to better understand the impacts of these changes here and to use those understandings to better inform what we can do to increase food system resilience and human health across multiple contexts. And so just to help position us, I find this really helpful to place Fiji and Hawaii together. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, this is Fiji, and the stars are the districts in which we worked. We worked across 4 different districts on 3 different islands of Fiji in about 50 different agroforests. And then this is an image of Hawaii on the top left. And as you can see, relatively speaking, in terms of landmass, there are pretty similar. The big island of Fiji, Viti Levu, is relatively similar in landmass to Hawaii Island, Big Island in Hawaii. The population is a bit different in Fiji. Across all islands, the population is just under 1 million, but about 88% of the land is under Ethel-K land tenure or traditional land tenure. So across agroecological systems, studies have shown that tree cover, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a good proxy for agroforestry, correlates to dietary diversity. And so in the same way that dietary diversity, which is essentially the diversity of different food groups in a diet, and food groups being things like dark leafy greens, orange fruits and vegetables, starchy staples, et cetera. Those are all examples of food groups. It's been used as a good proxy for nutrition. So tree cover, a good proxy for agroforestry, dietary diversity, a good proxy for nutrition. But these studies have not necessarily directly assessed the capacity of agroforests to contribute to nutrition. Furthermore, the mechanisms and the framework to understand this correlation that we do see between tree cover and dietary diversity have largely been assumed without necessarily a sort of mechanistic or theoretic understanding explaining it. What we do know, though, is that a lot of this does proceed through agrobiodiversity. And this is the biodiversity of all food and non-food plants and things like crop wild relatives, important for gene transfer, for climate resilient traits, et cetera. And so some of these examples are things like in the agroforest that we studied are things like pumpkin or cucurbits, Painizami or Flaircidia, windbreak trees, or emergency foods, kaile in this case, which is a type of yam. And so the study really looks beyond tree cover and dietary diversity to assess the links between agroforests and nutrition. And so we do this by applying a functional trait approach to better understand these mechanisms. And just going to give a brief overview of functional diversity to kind of help get us grounded a little bit. So what is functional diversity? Functional diversity was born in the ecological space, which sought to understand to answer, some of the questions about why was biodiversity necessary for human and environmental health. To which the answer was, of course, because it helps provide the necessary ecosystem services that provide those things I mentioned earlier, like water regulation, carbon sequestration, and ultimately our food provisioning services. But how does it do that? And then the answer to that is through the traits and associated functions that the species composing that biodiversity affords the system. So how does this all work together? So for example, in this very simplified diagram, let's consider cassava as plant B on the screen and corn as plant D. All of these plants are composed of or have the capacity for the same functional traits. They're just present in different quantities or magnitudes. So those functional traits, as you can see here, are represented by a red circle, a green square, a blue triangle, etc. So functional traits can be divided up into two general types: response traits on the left here, and then effect traits. And so effect traits are those that affect ecosystem function and processes themselves. I kind of like to think of them as business as usual functions. And then response traits are those that are important in the face of disasters or disturbances, or climate disasters or disturbances, and that which help a plant or an ecosystem recover from those impacts or resist catastrophic collapse. And so there are generally two things that I do like to highlight with this. Is that first, there is no one plant, neither cassava nor the corn here, that is contributing to the entirety of the resilience component, and it never will be. Rather, it's the presence of both and the complementary traits that they bring to the table that contributes to resilience. So you can see here with the red and the blue arrows. And then the second point is that you can see here one trait can be important for both resilience and recovery and business as usual, as exemplified through this blue triangle. So it's not, it's not a singular answer in this. It's more a question of how are things all working together within a system. And so to recap, as I mentioned, biodiversity has long been understood as necessary to ecosystem function. However, functional trait ecology posits that it's more the functions afforded by the species rather than just the biodiversity itself, right? So in this way, the level of biodiversity has less consequence as compared to the level of functions that the biodiversity supports through those variations in traits. And those traits can vary at the individual level, they can vary at the species level, or even at the trophic level. And so for a very simple example, a forest that might be composed of 10 different trees on this top part of your screen, that performs maybe a total of 5 different functions, might be more biodiverse but less functionally diverse than a forest composed of maybe only 6 different trees on the bottom, but performing a functional diversity or having a functional diversity score of 15, for example. And so in this case, if you were to have a climate disturbance like a heat wave come through, the idea then is that the forest that had a lower functional diversity, even though the biodiversity was higher, its ability to adapt or resist, right, the resilience or the response traits might be lower, meaning that it would have lower resilience to that specific disturbance. Whereas in the example on the bottom, the forest that had a higher diversity in terms of its functionality might be able to better have greater resilience to that disturbance, and then improved adaptive capacity moving forward. So what are traits from an ecological perspective? So traits are morphological, biochemical, physiological, structural, phenological, or other characteristics of organisms that influence, again, how they respond to the environment or their effects on ecosystem properties or ecosystem services. So in this case, that can be things such as pollinator syndrome. How many different pollinators can pollinate this plant, or which types of organisms are able to do so. It could include things like clonality or its reproductive mechanisms just in general. Is it exclusively seed, or can it be seed and clones? This also includes things like its specific leaf area, how tall can it grow? This has to do with accessing light or taking advantage of different light pockets in an ecosystem. What is its rooting depth? This has implications for soil stability or water regulation. And then what are new traits from a nutritional perspective? I think that this is almost a little bit easier to conceptualize because we look at these things almost on a daily basis when we look at nutrition labels on the foods that we eat. So these can be things such as number of edible plant parts. So in the case of sweet potato here, right, we know that we can eat the roots. Those are sweet potatoes that we are very familiar with consuming, but the leaves of sweet potatoes are also edible and very nutritious. And then, as I mentioned, that nutrition label, right? So things like macronutrients, fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and then micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. Excuse me. And so just from a theoretical perspective, these traits are linked in agroecosystems in various ways. Excuse me. So for example, when leguminous cover crops such as peas are planted in tandem with other crops like corn, for example, the nitrogen fixation ability of the peas, which the nitrogen fixation ability is the ecological trait, improves not only the overall yield of both crops, but also the protein content in the corn, and that protein content then being the nutritional trait. In another example over here on the left, terpenes, these are precursors to vitamin A, which is a nutritional trait, attract pollinators, which is the pollination syndrome, the ecological trait. The resulting pollinated fruit then serves as a source of vitamin A for us in diets. And then finally, a particularly interesting one, I think, is this example in the middle. Photosynthetic pathway is an important determinant of zinc content in poaceae crops. So under projected increases in CO2 due to climate change, whereby C4 grasses, it's been shown that C4 grasses actually maintain production of zinc, and C3 grasses experience a decrease in production. So under climate change induced projected increases, photosynthetic pathway, that's that ecological trait, then has been shown to be really important in zinc production, the nutritional trait of these crops. If we have a little bit of time, I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, if time's permitting. But so to bring it all together, to kind of apply this functional trait approach, we can quantify the impacts of more functionally diversified food systems. In this specific example of an agroecological system for overall resilience. Pulling these concepts together, I like to use this diagram. Functions then can be broken down, as I mentioned, into the traits that allow for them. So reproductive functions, for example, on the left, on the ecological side, are then facilitated by traits such as seed mass, seed dispersal syndrome. Similarly, immune support functions in humans then are often facilitated by nutritional traits like vitamins and minerals. And just as a reminder here too, as we're thinking about resilience across all of this, the ecological functions that we use in this work are all functions that are important in resilience. So they're all using response traits that are important in resilience to disturbances. Okay, so how do you measure functional diversity? This was a really difficult concept for. It took a long time for me to understand. It's mathematically heavy in my mind, but there are 4 different components that are often used in functional diversity analyses in the ecological literature that take place in sort of multi-dimensional space. And so I've attempted to create some 3-dimensional imagery with this. So functional richness, which is on the left, is the total range of trait values in a community and kind of reflects, therefore, the most extreme and maximum value possible of all traits in combination. So as you saw, that bubble kind of expanded and contracted. In the context of human nutrition, this can be interpreted sort of as the diversity of different nutrients and other compounds in the foods in the system in which you're looking at. So for example, if you have if you're looking basically at a monoculture of crops, that richness is not going to be super voluminous, right? You're going to have a very kind of strict availability or definition of what types of nutrients are available because you've got one singular crop in that system. Whereas when you diversify it, you're incorporating multiple different micronutrients and macronutrients into that system. So your richness is going to be greater. Now, this space, this richness, right, may or may not be filled with additional species, as I just mentioned, composed of different trait combinations composed of additional macro and micronutrients that can kind of help to sort of even out or fill the availability of each of those identified traits. So functional evenness then describes kind of how evenly distributed these traits are within that functional space. In the context of human nutrition, again, this can be interpreted as the balance or proportion of different nutrients and compounds available for the diet. Basically, are they present in amounts useful for human nutrition? Now, these are the two that we found to be the most important in terms of ecological and nutritional functional diversity in an agroecosystem. Dispersion and divergence are often used in the ecological trait literature, and they have importance there for sure. Dispersion is a measure of how different trait combinations are from the average of all traits, or a weighted centroid. So averaging all of them at the center, and then how disparate are each individual species from the average of all of them in that trait space. And then finally, divergence is a measure of group polarity. So essentially, are there lots of similar extreme trait combinations in a system? And so, as I mentioned, while all of these measures have relevance ecologically, we determined that really functional richness and evenness are the ones that are most relevant for this linkage between ecology and nutrition. And so through our work, we hypothesized that ecological functional diversity would predict nutritional functional diversity. And to test this, we collected information about of agroforests and their biodiversity in 2019. And this was 3 years after Cyclone Winston, which I mentioned earlier. And so across all of these agroforests, it was about 50 in total across 10 different villages in 4 different districts across 3 of the largest islands in Fiji. We collected information about the biodiversity and then the ecological traits. And again, these are all response traits that are important in resilience to disturbance, since we specifically wanted to link that resilience to agroforests or in agroforests to nutrition. So across all of these surveys, we recorded 171 species. And put that into a matrix, which I'll talk a little bit more about in this next slide, but essentially the species names or the Latin names are on the left, the ecological function of importance are across the right, and then the values therein to which those species could take are in the heart of this Excel spreadsheet. So essentially, these span categorical, numerical, binary traits. So nitrogen fixation being a binary trait, right? You either do or you don't. Photosynthetic pathway, there's a couple different options for that. Was it clonal? What type of life form does it take on, et cetera? And so then you turn these into 2 different ecological matrices. You have a species by agroforest matrix, which is just a presence or absence matrix. So along the left side, you've got the agroforest in and of itself, and then across the top, you've got all 171 species that you had recorded in those surveys, and it's just a 1 or a 0 whether or not that plant was present. And then you create a species by trait matrix, which is that previous slide that I just showed you, where you've got your species on the left, you've got the functional trait across the top, and then you've got the value therein of each of those species and how they represent that trait or that function. And a lot of this was taken from the TRI database, if folks are familiar. And then this is the nutritional side of things. So we call these nutritional traits. It's very similar to, or essentially the same as the nutrition label on the foods that we consume. So all of these nutritional traits or nutrients were standardized at 100 grams edible portion, nutritional content for 100 grams edible portion. We recorded 111 edible species. However, information was only complete for 97 of those. And when I say complete, it means that it was somewhere in the literature. There is I'll talk a little bit about this towards the end, but nutritional information that is found in national nutrition databases sort of being the most standardized and the most informative for human nutrition, and where we couldn't find it in nutrition composition databases, we would go to primary literature. However, basically the standards of how you analyze that information is not uniform across all labs. So there is some discrepancies there. And then we recorded 147 edible plant parts, and information was complete for 131 of those. So what that means is, going back to that sweet potato example, right? Some plants have multiple edible plant parts, and they can be very different in their nutritional content. And so we treated each edible plant part, right, the sweet potato root versus the sweet potato leaf, as a different sort of species when we translate it back to the ecological terminology. Because in the same way that each species has a different suite of traits that are important in different functions in an ecosystem, each edible plant part, similar to a species, plays a different role in humans from a nutritional standpoint when consumed. So this is just kind of an example of all the nutritional information that we collected. We collected 15 different nutritional traits. I won't go through all of them, but it's essentially the macro and micronutrients that are important for people in diets. And so we standardized these, as I mentioned, to 100 grams edible portion. And we weighted the recommended dietary intake. We weighted this to the recommended dietary intake of a woman between the ages of 19 to 50 on a 2,200 calorie diet with a macronutrient split of 35, 45, 20 carbohydrate, protein, and fat. We weighted this to a woman's dietary needs, as women across places are often the last to eat food. And so oftentimes have, unfortunately, the least nutritionally dense diets. They're often the most impacted by nutrition-related non-communicable diseases. And so if these places are able to meet the nutritional needs of a woman in this demographic, it's kind of a baseline to ensure that there might be adequate nutrition across the board. So this is the nutritional matrix. Just as I mentioned, we did this by edible plant part in the agroforest as opposed to just species, right? So again, the agroforests locations are listed across the left, and across the top are the edible plant part, the species by edible plant part, a 1 or a 0 if it was present or not, and then edible plant part by trait. So edible plant part, species edible plant part down the left, and then that micro or macronutrient category, and then the quantity therein that edible plant part is contributing. And I won't go into this specifically, but a lot of folks do ask me about the actual functional diversity analysis and the package itself. So this is a standard R package FD, measuring functional diversity for multiple traits. And once you get all this, the data, those spreadsheets I just mentioned in the previous slides are actually the difficult part of all of this. Once you've got all of once you've got all that data collected, the functional diversity analysis in and of itself is pretty straightforward. What it does spit out, though, are these relatively uninformational sort of numbers, unless you do something with them. So as you can see here, the calculated functional diversity indices measure the functional diversity of your species data. Higher values indicate greater diversity, but right now it's just a bunch of numbers. And so how do we make sense of all of this? And so also what you can kind of see here is it spits out multiple sort of functional evenness, richness, diversion, dispersion, but you can also get Rouse entropy, et cetera, from this package. And so what we did then to make sense of it is regressed ecological functional richness against nutritional functional richness, and then ecological functional evenness against nutritional functional evenness. And what we found is that ecological functional richness and evenness are significant positive predictors of nutritional functional richness and evenness in the agroforests that we studied. Ecological functional traits are hypothesized, as I mentioned, to be linked to these nutritional functional traits, both directly and indirectly. Going back to that example I gave of the agroforest and the different ways that they're connected, plant primary and secondary metabolites, which are things like carbohydrates and vitamins, et cetera, are functionally relevant across the ecological and nutritional fields. They support plant growth and reproduction. Those are things that are reflected in traits like wood density or seed mass, respectively. But then they also attract pollinators and seed dispersers. Nutritionally, these metabolites are considered macro and micronutrients in diets, and then they also play key roles in human growth and development. And so basically what these nutritionally, what these indicators mean together is that there's a wide range or richness, right, like I talked about before, of nutrients with sufficient density or evenness for them to be functionally useful. And so these methods could be used as planning tools to help design agroecosystems that can provide important ecological and nutritional functions. They can also be applied at different scales. So assessing the relationships between ecological and nutritional functional diversity at additional scales, such as regionally or global food systems levels, could help provide a greater understanding of the interrelationships between ecology and nutrition. In terms of scaling up, identifying if and how the relationships between nutritional and ecological functional diversity indices vary over time and space would be important. And when measures such as and considering when measures such as functional dispersion or divergence might be important and allow for broader application. Very recently and excitingly, downscaling the application of the nutritional functional diversity assessment has been applied to the level of the plate. So kind of treating plate, literally a dietary recall survey, as the system, as the ecosystem in the ways that we've just described it, has been shown to have novel insights about consumed nutritional quality. So throughout this work that I've just described, we have been talking specifically about basically nutritional potential or nutrition in the agroecosystem. But as I mentioned just now, this indice or this functional diversity metric has now been applied at the level of the plate, and has shown actually to be a better indicator of nutritional consumption than those dietary diversity assessments alone have been able to do. So that's exciting. And then I think what would be really exciting is the next step is to then use that sort of nutritional functional diversity assessment of the plate and assess that to the relationship of the nutritional functional diversity in the agroforest, right? Again, this would be achieved by comparing the nutritional functional diversity basically of diets to the food production system, and would provide currently missing sort of quantitative links between agroecosystems and their direct contributions to diet. And hopefully be useful in motivating policy decisions to help promote agroforestry or more diversified agroecological systems, and other sort of sustainable and nutrition-focused food production systems. We do have this data for this study in Fiji. So we do have nutritional 24-hour dietary recall surveys across 3 years in Fiji. And so if there are folks interested, this is a massive amount of data, but I think this would be really well suited for a grad student or a research position. So please feel free to reach out if you are interested. And then this can also be applied across additional contexts. So because it's based on functions necessary for resilience, and this can be sort of identified across any discipline, as long as you can identify the functions that are necessary for whatever sort of resilience you're interested in, and then the associated traits that are important for those functions in responding to those environmental or economic disturbances, i.e. global change, then you can assess the resilience and suggest ways to improve it across multiple dimensions, right? And so I started working a little bit on this in my last position with the Environmental Defense Fund. And this is again sort of another interest or goal of mine. And if anybody is interested, very much looking to collaborate on how to create these sort of decision support tools for producers. For producers. And so in this specific case, we had started to put together something that would include sort of geographic location that would help to load certain climate variables, list the climate hazard of concern, and then you could list out the different components of your agroecosystem or perhaps your marine environment or whatever those later categories might be, to help understand sort of what does resilience look like in your system, and then based on a list of additional sort of plants and their associated traits, could help to provide recommendations on where your system might need additional functional diversity to help build up its resilience and suggest species important in building that out. All of this said, there are particular important gaps, unfortunately, in trait data. So trait data is pretty significantly lacking across ecological and nutritional dimensions. So from an ecological perspective, agricultural crops, as I mentioned, I use the TRI database. There's not a ton of information for agricultural crops in those databases, especially for agricultural crops important to the Pacific, canoe crops, et cetera. And then, of course, of rare and endemic species. And then on the nutritional side, crop cultivars, right? So a good example is if you go to, for the USDA, where all of our nutritional information is stored that contribute to a lot of the policy that we implement in the US. This is at the USDA Food Data Central, or FDC. And if you go in and look at the nutrition composition for sweet potatoes, for example, I believe the singular sweet potato listed is the orange cultivar, or the orange variety that's grown in the southeast of the US, so the south of the US. But of course, here in Hawaii, we have multiple cultivars of sweet potatoes in purple, white, yellow, et cetera. And you can tell just by just looking at the colors of each sweet potato, it is going to have a different micronutrient content, especially across cultivars. And so that's not represented in the food composition databases that we currently have. And so that's a gap. And then, of course, just plain and simple emergency or underutilized food plants. If they're not commonly consumed, they don't make it into these food databases at current. But if they are important in these sort of disturbance regimes, they are also critically important in documenting this nutritional diversity. And so this is a project. I think I'm going to go across this slide, but this is a project that I'm working on with the I'll skip one more, excuse me, with the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, which is a Rockefeller and American Heart Association collaboration, along with partners at CIOT/CGIAR. I know they're going through some restructuring, but essentially what we do know, or there is some information on in terms of climate impacts, is particularly CO2 increase. That's the climate impacts of particular research focus right now. But it's for the big 5 global crops, so maize, potato, soybean, et cetera. What we don't know, which is a lot, is on the climate impacts, particularly relevant in the Pacific, so saltwater intrusion, drought and flooding, or just changes in precipitation and changes in temperature across the big 5 quote unquote Pacific crops. So these are the most important starchy staples in Fiji, especially ulu, kalo, yam, sweet potato, and cassava. And so that's kind of where we're headed with the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. And if anybody is interested in learning more about that, I would be happy to discuss more. And with that, then I will say mahalo. Thank you, everyone.
Mahalo to you, Ashley.
All right, mahalo, Ashley, for sharing that really interesting work with us. This is time for questions from the audience and our online attendees. Folks online, feel free to raise your virtual hand if you have a question. It's in the Zoom controls under the React button. You'll see a hand there. Or feel free to leave questions in the chat as well. And we'll get to those. Folks here in the room, we have some microphones. There's one on the table there. Just ask you to grab one of these microphones if you have a question. We can hand those around. Here's one more. So let's start here in the room. Any questions for Ashley? Yes. Well, thank you.
Aloha, Ashley. Great talk. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I just had a question because you were looking at categories or traits such as clonal and non-clonal, and knowing that genetic diversity can contribute to resilience. I was just curious in terms of clonal ag plants versus non-clonal, did you see any connection there? because I know a lot of clonal plants are used for agricultural production. So just curious how that plays out.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. A lot of plants, especially in the Pacific, right, are clonally reproduced. I see your question is, sorry if I can repeat it back to you, difference in resilience across clonal and non-clonal, between clonal and non-clonal? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm not hearing it, but I think I'm seeing yes. Gosh, great question. I mean, I will say that definitely did see, I guess, resprout more quickly from trees that could propagate clonally. And of course, like immediately after the cyclone, sweet potato is one of the most, it grows really quickly. It's super easy to grow up. And so that was the number one sort of starchy staple that was grown again after the cyclone. In Fiji too, that's not folks' most favorite starchy staple. And so it was kind of like, it's interesting in that it's really important in recovery. And so that's why it was the first to be replanted. But as soon as the kalo could come back and they had access to those planting materials, that was what was used after. But I don't have a direct answer, I don't think, to your question, but it's an interesting one.
Thank you for sharing.
All right. Just pausing here for any other questions online or here in the room. Darren.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks for sharing your study in Fiji. I just wanted to ask, about work in other places. So does this work properly apply? Would you see similar sorts of trends and results, if you were to look at other types of Pacific islands?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't necessarily, I guess what we did do in those regression analyses, we did take a look at sort of from an ecological perspective, the plants that had the least sort of ecological diversity and what did that mean for the nutritional aspects. I mean, it is it's still predicted, even if you had low ecological functional diversity, the nutritional functional diversity did scale upwards with it. I think because it is though based in sort of that locally adapted indigenous knowledge informed agroforestry design and production systems. I think that's particularly important and why ecological and nutritional functional diversity were so well tightly correlated. So that might have implications for how it might, how it might vary across, stewards of different production systems. But that is one of the things that we want to look at too, is, sort of what we didn't take into, we had the opportunity, I suppose, to look at sort of more commercialized food production systems in Fiji. And we did focus specifically on the agroforests because they were, so highly resilient to these, to this disturbance. But it would be important, I think, to look at perhaps less diversified commercial food production systems and how does that relate to the nutritional aspects.
Great. Cindy, do you have a question?
I do.
Yeah, go
yes,
ahead.
thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I was also interested in the work that you did in Fiji and just curious, what are some of the techniques that you use to share the results of your work with community members and if you were able to engage them in your research?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I didn't get to talk about it, but so this was the research that I just presented was basically from 1 year. It was 2019, 3 years post-cyclone, but our work was across 2016, 17, 18, and 19. And so every year that we would go back to these places, one, we would present the preliminary sort of research results of what we were seeing at that from the previous year's data collection. It would also be an opportunity for us to have talanoa or kind of talk story with the villages and ask what kinds of questions did they have that we could incorporate into the next year's field season. And then also just listening and engaging with the Ministry of Agriculture in Fiji and the Ministry of Forestry there were times when folks would ask for particular planting materials and things like that. And just, being that liaison across the ministry, which, it's not always easy to travel to all of these places. And so just kind of being a communicator or a liaison to help, bring the requests to the Ministry of Agriculture. So, and then unfortunately the last year at field season, or the last year, it was COVID immediately after. And so that, we couldn't go back and deliver the research results again for the final year. But, after the research was over, it was important to me to go back and deliver the research results on my own time. And so I went back and presented to what I could access, which was the university, the ministries, and several NGOs. And so that's how we brought the research back.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Well, we're approaching the hour. Folks have meetings and things to get to. We probably ought to wrap it up unless there's one last burning question here. Okay, not seeing any. Well, this concludes our Slice of PI-CASC seminar series for the academic year. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the fall. Thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you, Ashley, again, for sharing all this great work with us. Another round of applause for Ashley.
Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody online, for joining us. Folks online, as you log off, you will have a seminar pop up to you automatically there. Please go ahead and share any ideas you have for future seminars. There are folks here in the room. If you have an idea for a future seminar, please share it with us for our fall lineup. Some of the folks we had speak with us this year came from those responses. Rest of the folks here in the room, we do have PI. Rachel, thank you again all year for all your work coordinating, helping to the logistics behind the scenes on this seminar series and the incredible PI baking. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Aloha. Thanks, Ashley, very much.